Good morning, everyone. This is Stephanie Jane P. Babeda, and we are still on the nature of qualitative research. Before we will proceed to the discussion, in this slide, I will first introduce the topics to be discussed, namely multi-stage cluster sampling, qualities of a probability sample, sample size, absolute and relative sample size, time and cost, non-response, heterogeneity of the population, and lastly, the kind of analysis. The multi-stage cluster sampling. We are familiar about clustering in our research study. So what exactly the importance of multi-stage cluster sampling to the qualitative research? In multi-stage cluster sampling, you draw a sample from a population using smaller and smaller groups or units at each stage. It is often used to collect data from a large geographically spread groups of people in national surveys. It can be a complex form of cluster sampling since it is a type of sampling which involves dividing the population into groups or clusters. When to use multi-stage cluster sampling. First is when population is spread into large geographical area. If the geographical area is large, the interviewer are more likely to travel to interview the sample students, but in the multi-stage cluster sampling, it will be easier for the interviewer to select a sample out of large geographical area. Second, when it is not feasible in terms of cost or time. As I was saying, the use of cluster sampling will lessen the cost and time being used of the interviewer, especially when the sample are drawn in a widely dispersed population. Third, when it is difficult to divide data into different strata. Especially in a widely dispersed population, it is difficult to draw a sample out of it. So, to use the multi-stage cluster sampling, it would be easier and less inconvenient. Lastly, when there are different subsets within a specific population. Using multi-stage cluster sampling would be a great help. First off, we would randomly select stages by first selecting clusters of elements. For example, we want to sample math performance in the population of all Filipino students currently in their second year of secondary education. So first, we will start forming a sampling frame of all districts. This is the first stage and where the students are clustered in districts. We randomly select a very small sample of school district. We can use stratification to make sure we include districts in rural and urban areas. So let us say that the pink color are the students clustered in districts. We are now done in selecting students in district clusters, then we can now proceed to the second stage. We randomly select schools from the previously selected districts, then students are now clustered in school. Lastly, the third-year math classes are randomly sampled from the previously selected school. Thus, stratification can be used in all of these stages since in multi-stage cluster sampling, it entails or has an involvement of stratification. So you can scan page 180 from the book Social Research Methods for further examples. The qualities of a probability sample. It is a selection of sample from a population, sampling technique in which the researcher chooses samples from a larger population using a method based on the theory of probability. It is a significant procedure in survey research since it allows inferences to be made from information about a random sample to the population from which it was extracted. So we can generalize findings derived from a sample to the population, but it is not to say that we will treat the population data and sample data as the same. So the population data, it is a set of individuals who share a characteristics of the entire population. A population is the entire group that you want to draw conclusion about. So sample data is a set of individuals or objects collected and selected from a statistical population by a defined procedure. A sample data is the specific group that you will collect data from. In quantitative research, the sample size is also important. So the sample size refers to the number of participants of observation included in the study. A determination of choosing the number of observation on replicates to include in a statistical sample. The sample size is an important feature of any empirical study in which the goal is to make inferences about a population from a sample. How can we say that our sample size is large, or how large the sample would be? First, it depends on a number of considerations. There is no defined answer in terms of sample size, and also the sample size are affected by this consideration or decision, namely the time and cost. Time refers to the amount of the time given of the interviewer, and the cost, it is the resources available and the convenience of collecting data. Therefore, the decision about sample size invariably represents a compromise between the constraints of time and cost, the need for precision, and a variety of further consideration that will now be addressed. In sample size, the size does really matter. In other words, the bigger the sample, the more representative it would be, including the range of people and the good response rate. We should take note that in doing or generating a random sample, we should not make claims about our sample that are not sustainable. The absolute and relative sample size. It is one of the most basic considerations is that contrary to what you might have expected, it is an absolute size of a sample is important and not its relative size. This means that as sample size increases, sampling error decreases. Increasing the size of a sample increases the precision of a sample. However, a large sample cannot be guaranteed precision, so that is probability better to say that increasing the size of a sample increases more likely the precision. As the sample size increases, the sampling error decreases. An important component of any decision about sample size should be how much sampling error is prepared. According to Fowler 1993, he argues that in practice researchers do not base their decision about sample size on a single estimate of a variable. Most survey research is concerned to generate a host of estimates, and that estimates of the variables that make up the research instrument that is administered. He also observed that it is not normal for survey researchers to be in a position to specify in advance a desired level of precision. The notion of using desired level of precision as a factor in decision about sample size is not realistic. Instead, to the extent that this notion does enter into decision about sample size, it usually does in general rather than in a calculated way. Time and cost. Time and cost considerations become very relevant in this context. In the previous paragraph, it is clearly being suggested that the larger the sample size, the greater the precision, because the amount of sampling error will be less. However, by and large, up to a sample size of around 1000, the gains in precision are noticeable as the sample size climbs from low figures of 50, 100, 150, and so on upwards. After a certain point, often in the region of 1000, the sharp increases in precision become less pronounced. There is a slowing down in the extent to which precision increases, and hence the extent to which the standard error of the mean declines. This means that the consideration of sample size are likely to be profoundly affected by matters of time and cost. At such a point, since striving for smaller and smaller increments of precision becomes an increasingly proposition. According to Hazelberg 2004, the larger the size of the sample drawn from a population, the more likely converges to mean, but the convergence occurs at the decelerating rate, which means that very large samples are decreasingly cost efficient. The consideration about sampling error do not end here. The problem of non-response should be borne in mind. So what exactly is non-response? Non-response, it is the most sample surveys attract a certain amount of non-response. Thus, it is more likely to that only some members are contactable, and of those who are contactable, some will refuse and chooses not to participate, and it is properly called the unit non-response. To distinguish this kind of non-response from item non-response. So there are two kinds of non-response. This is the unit non-response and the item non-response. So unit non-response, these are the people who are more likely to refuse or not to participate on the said survey. And well, in contrast, the item non-response, it is the specific question on the survey that are accidentally or deliberately fail to answer the question. So we have here the example. If we aim to ensure as far as possible that 450 students in Central Mindanao University are interviewed, and if we think that there may be 20% of rate of non-response, it may be advisable to sample 550 to 560 nasayop na siya, individual on the grounds that are approximately 90 will be non-respondent. Because there are issues of non-response and in particular of refusal to participate is significant because it has been suggested by some researchers that response rate to surveys are declining in many countries. This implies that there is a growing tendency towards people refusing to participate in any social survey research. However, this is not to say that steps should not be taken to improve response rate. So there is a survey of New Zealand residents by Brennan and Carbonneau 2009. They provide strong evidence of the improvement in response rate that can be achieved by at least 2 follow-up mailings to the respondents to postal questionnaire surveys, which tend to achieve lower response rate than comparable interview-based surveys. Also, a chocolate sent with the questionnaire helps too, apparently. In the future, it seems likely that given that there will probably be limits on the degree to which a survey researcher can boost the response rate. More and more effort will go into refining ways of estimating and correcting for anticipated biases in findings. Heterogeneity of the population. Another consideration is the homogeneity and heterogeneity of the population from which the sample is to be taken. When a population is very heterogeneous, such as a whole country or city, a larger sample will be needed to reflect the varied population. In contrast, when a population is homogeneous, such as population of students or members of occupation, the amount of variation is less, therefore the sample can be smaller. Note that the implication of this is the greater the heterogeneity of a population, the larger a sample will need to be. Finally, researchers should bear in mind the kind of analysis they intend to undertake. A case in point here is a contingency table. A contingent cargo. Consideration of sample size should be sensitive to the kind of analysis that will be subsequently required. A larger sample will be necessitated by the nature of the analysis to be conducted as well as the nature of the variables in the question.